She was left to die in her own wedding dress. But the man who would save her was far more dangerous than the storm, and they were both tangled in a secret that would eventually burn the whole town down. It all started on a day the sky turned its back on the world. The snow came down thick and silent, a white curtain dropping on a terrible play. It covered every track, every hope, every sign that a wedding was supposed to happen here. The horses were gone, the wagon was gone, the groom and his fine family were long gone. All that was left was the old mountain chapel, a freezing wind, and a girl named Juniper Wade. She stood on the steps, her white dress already turning gray in the dusk, the veil fluttering around her face like a trapped ghost. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury, and she had nothing. Not when the preacher told her the groom wasn't coming. Not when the groom's own mother, the sharp-faced Mrs. Haskell, pressed a handkerchief into her hand with a look of pure relief. And definitely not when that same woman leaned in and whispered a line so cruel it felt like a slap. These things happen when you come from mud and try to walk on marble floors, dear. The small crowd of guests had scattered like crows. They left her there, alone, clutching a pathetic bouquet of wild yarrow she'd picked herself because the groom's family wouldn't pay for flowers. A charity case. That's all she'd ever been to them. She felt the eyes on her from the town below, faces peeking from behind frosty windows judging her. Mr. Thornby at the mercantile was probably already telling everyone the boy had come to his senses. She had no dowry, no land, nothing but the dress on her back, a dress that was supposed to be her future. Now it felt like a shroud. There was nowhere to go. Her uncle, who'd brought her out west, was long gone to California. The few belongings she owned were already at the groom's house, a house whose door was now bolted shut to her forever. The boarding house locked up tight at sundown. So she walked, past the town, past the last flickering light, her fancy too-small boots slipping on the ice. The cold was a physical thing, a monster sinking its teeth into her bones. She finally stumbled into the only shelter she could find, the church's old, broken-down stable. It smelled of rust and decay, but it had a roof. She crawled under a saddle rack, curling into the shadows like a stray dog, and pulled the thin veil over her face. The snow drifted through cracks in the roof, landing silently around her. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Or maybe it was just the wind, mocking her. She didn't sleep. She just lay there, feeling the life slowly freezing out of her. By morning, she could barely move her fingers. Her lips were blue. She thought this was the end. And that's when she heard the hooves. They weren't the prancing hooves of the pastor's horse or the sheriff's gelding. These were heavy, powerful. The sound of a beast that knew the mountains, that didn't care about roads or rules. The stable door creaked open, a dark shape filling the doorway, blocking out the gray morning light. It was him, the man they whispered about in town, the one they called a savage, Tala Blackhorse, the Comanche widower who lived so high up the timberline he might as well have lived on the moon. He only came to town when he had to, a silent, brooding giant of a man. The rumors were true. He was impossibly tall, built from stone and shadow. He wore no coat, only layers of hide, with a thick blanket slung over one shoulder. A long, pale scar snaked down his neck, a story she didn't want to know. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his dark eyes taking in the ruined dress, the shivering frame, the utter despair. He saw she wasn't dead, not yet. He stepped inside. The air changed. He moved with a quiet purpose that was terrifying. He placed a bundle on the floor near her. It was a thick wool blanket, and it smelled of wood smoke and cedar. Then, he crouched and laid down a small stack of dry pine and a piece of flint. He didn't offer to build the fire for her. He just left the tools. Then he turned and walked out, disappearing back into the snow as silently as he'd arrived. Juniper stared at the spot where he'd stood, wondering if she was hallucinating. Was he a ghost? A creation of her freezing mind? But the blanket was real. She pulled it around her shoulders, the warmth a shocking comfort. Her numb fingers fumbled with the flint and stone, her hands moving on pure instinct. A spark caught, then another. A tiny flame flickered to life, a fragile heartbeat in the crushing silence. She huddled over it, feeding it splinters of wood, tears finally freezing on her cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, tears of survival. She had a fire, but she knew the man who brought it was not a friend. He was something else entirely. And she had a terrible feeling he would be back. The fire was her anchor in a world that had thrown her overboard. She spent the entire day feeding it, watching the flames dance, her mind a complete blank. The shame, the humiliation, it was all still there, but the immediate threat of freezing to death had pushed it into a corner. She was alive. That was all that mattered for now. As dusk fell, painting the snow outside in shades of bruised purple, the stable door creaked open again. He was back. Tala Blackhorse stepped inside, the snow swirling around his powerful frame. This time he carried a tin cup. Steam rose from it, a ghost of a promise in the frigid air. It smelled of stew, rich and thick. He didn't approach her, didn't try to hand it to her. He walked to the fire, placed the cup on the stones nearby, and then backed away, giving her space. He stood by the door, a silent sentinel, his face impossible to read in the flickering light. His voice, when it came, was as deep and rough as stones grinding in a riverbed. "You don't have to say yes." She froze, her hand hovering over the cup. "But you'll die out here," he continued, his voice flat, stating a simple fact. Snow doesn't wait for sorrow. She didn't answer. She couldn't, but her body betrayed her. Her hand shot out and grabbed the cup, the metal warm against her frozen fingers. She brought it to her lips and drank, not caring if it was poisoned. The stew was thick with beans and wild onion, the elk fat coating her throat, burning a trail of life all the way down to her empty stomach. It was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted. When she finished, she finally looked at him, really looked at him, not as a man, but as a force of nature, like checking the sky for a storm. His expression was still a mask, but his hands were empty, relaxed at his sides. He wasn't here to hurt her. He was here for something else. "I ain't a preacher," he said, his voice low. "And I don't want a woman who don't want to be here. But my roof is whole and my fire's strong. You need a place. I need someone who ain't afraid to sit quiet." It wasn't an offer of marriage. It wasn't an offer of love. It was a business transaction, a trade of survival. Her mind screamed at her. Go with a stranger? A savage? The town would have a field day. They already thought she was mud. This would be sinking into the earth itself. Her lips parted, and a single trembling word escaped. "No." He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her. He just gave a single sharp nod, as if he expected it. He turned and stepped back into the blizzard, his form beginning to dissolve into the swirling white. She felt a bizarre pang of regret, of terror. What had she just done? But then, just before the storm swallowed him completely, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "I'll leave a light on the ridge," he called out, his voice carried on the wind. "Come if you want. If not, no shame." And then he was gone. Juniper sat by her dying fire, the wool blanket wrapped around her, the empty cup in her lap. The stable felt colder than ever. She thought of Mrs. Haskell's sneer, the laughing faces of her almost sisters-in-law, the averted eyes of the whole town. They had left her to die. This stranger, this wild man, had offered her a fire. Twice. She rose to her feet. The decision was not made in her head. It was made in her bones, in the deep primal part of her that refused to break. She took the last piece of pine he had left her, tucked it into the bodice of her ruined dress, and stepped out of the stable. She didn't even bother with the useless boots. Barefoot, she walked into the snow. The cold was a blade, but she didn't care. High on the ridge above the town, she could see it, a single tiny point of amber light, a beacon in the darkness, a fire that had been lit just for her. She didn't run. She walked. Each step was a silent rebellion. She wasn't walking toward a man. She was walking away from the ashes of the girl she was supposed to be, and she was walking toward a fire. The journey up the ridge was a blur of pain and determination. The snow bit at her bare feet, climbing past her ankles, the heavy wool blanket he'd given her dragging behind like a funeral train for her old life. The air was so cold, her breath crystallized in front of her face, tiny puffs of defiance against the crushing night. She kept her eyes locked on that single point of light, the amber glow that pulsed like a distant heart. It was the only thing in the world that felt real. When she finally crested the rise, the cabin materialized from the swirling snow. It wasn't grand. It was a dark, sturdy shape, low to the ground, built to withstand the rage of the mountain. It looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. There was no welcome mat, no flowers, just stacks of firewood and a broken horseshoe nailed over the door for luck. Or maybe as a warning. She stood before the door, her hand raised, ready to knock, but her knuckles never made contact. The door swung open. Tala stood there, a shadow in the doorway, as still and silent as a stone carving. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stepped backward, creating a space for her to enter. It wasn't an invitation. It was a choice. Her choice. She stepped across the threshold. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. The air inside was thick with the smell of cedar smoke, drying herbs and something else, something wild and masculine. The floor was worn pine, swept clean. A fire burned low and steady in a massive stone hearth. A rough-hewn table held a knife and a bundle of herbs, nothing more. The walls were hung with tanned pelts, bear, fox, deer, all folded neatly, tools for survival, not trophies of conquest. A rifle leaned near the door. Her eyes were drawn to the far side of the single room. A curtain of dark beads hung in a doorway, swaying slightly in the draft. It seemed to hide the cabin's only secret. Tala saw her looking. He walked past her, his movements economical and silent, and stoked the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney like angry prayers. "There's a corner bed," he said, his back to her. "Made ready. You can have it. I sleep by the stove." She didn't move, just stood there dripping melted snow onto his clean floor, the frost thawing from her skin but the shame clinging colder than ice. He poured hot water from a kettle into a cup and held it out to her. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. She felt the hard calluses on his skin, the product of tools and labor, not cruelty. "There's bread," he said, gesturing to the table. "Not fresh. Still good." "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. He just nodded and moved away, giving her the entire space. She drank the water but couldn't touch the bread. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed. She stumbled to the narrow bed in the corner. The blankets were heavy wool, smelling of the same smoke and cedar as the one he'd given her in the stable. It smelled like him. Using her tattered veil as a pillowcase, a final insult to her old life, she collapsed into a dreamless sleep. The sound of an axe splitting wood woke her at dawn. She peered through a crack in the shutters. Outside, in the gray, snowy light, Tala was chopping firewood. He was bare-armed, steam rising from his broad shoulders, as if he were a beast breathing in the cold. He worked with a relentless, powerful rhythm, completely unaware, or completely indifferent, that she was watching him. When he came back inside, he didn't greet her. He stacked the new wood by the hearth, poured himself a bowl of the same stew from the night before, and sat at the table. He didn't offer her any. He just slid a second bowl and a spoon across the table toward her empty seat. The message was clear. You are not a guest. You are not a prisoner. You are here. If you want to eat, eat. She took the bowl. They ate in absolute silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the crackle of the fire. The quiet should have been awkward, but it wasn't. It was solid, grounded. After they ate, she began to clean. She didn't know why. She just couldn't stand to be idle. She washed the 2 bowls, the 2 spoons, the pot. She swept the ash that had settled near the hearth. He didn't ask her to. He didn't thank her. He just watched her out of the corner of his eye as he sharpened a hunting knife with a whetstone. This became their routine, a life of silent gestures. He would hunt and chop wood. She would cook and clean and mend. They were two ghosts haunting the same small space, orbiting each other but never touching. She learned the rhythms of his life. He always left his boots by the door, soles facing east. He sharpened his knives every Sunday. He never, ever went behind the beaded curtain. One day, her curiosity finally won. "What's behind the curtain?" she asked, her voice small. He didn't even look up from the fire he was staring into. "The life I already lost." She never asked again, but the town hadn't forgotten about her. Sheriff Keller rode up the mountain one afternoon, his face a mixture of duty and suspicion. "Juniper Wade?" he asked, looking from her to the silent, imposing figure of Tala standing beside her. "We had folks in town concerned. Need to know you're here of your own free will." Tala didn't say a word. He just looked at Juniper, letting her speak for herself. It was the first time anyone had done that. "I'm not a prisoner, Sheriff," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. The sheriff tipped his hat, looking unconvinced. "Well, all right then." He rode off, but Juniper knew it wasn't over. The whispers in town grew louder, uglier. They said she'd gone savage, that she'd sold her soul for a roof over her head. Her groom's sisters, Pearl and Nettie, were telling people at the general store that he'd put some kind of spell on her. "Should have known she'd end up in a wigwam with her kind of blood," they were heard saying. Tala never mentioned the gossip, but the pile of split firewood behind the cabin grew to a monstrous size. He was working out his anger on the forest. One night she found him by the fire, holding a small unfinished wood carving of a bird. His thumb stroked the wood grain over and over, a gesture of profound, hidden grief. She sat across from him. "My name is still Juniper Wade," she said quietly. "I don't belong to the man who left me. I don't belong to this town. And I don't belong to you." He finally looked up, his dark eyes studying her face. "I ain't asking for anything from you," he said, his voice rough. "Not your name, not your shame." A tiny, bitter smile touched her lips. "What if I want to give something?" He stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked her. He stood up, walked to the beaded curtain, and lifted it. He didn't step through, but he held it open for her. Her heart pounded as she rose and walked toward him. She peered into the hidden room. It was a shrine, a small bed, neatly made, a woman's silver-backed comb on a small table, a simple dress folded inside a cedar chest, and in the corner, a small, empty cradle, its wood sanded smooth by years of touch. "She died birthing our child," Tala said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "The boy died with her." He dropped the curtain, plunging the memory back into darkness. He turned to face her, his expression raw. "I never brought another woman to this mountain, never thought I would." Juniper looked from his face to the dark curtain, and a sudden chilling thought struck her. He wasn't just grieving, he was hiding something. The way he said it. "She died birthing our child." It felt rehearsed, too simple. She looked at the empty cradle, then back at his hardened face. The story didn't feel right. The town's fear of him, the sheriff's suspicion, his intense, violent privacy. It wasn't just about grief. It was about guilt. And in that moment she realized she wasn't living with a heartbroken widower. She was living with a man who had a secret darker than any winter night, and she was trapped on a mountain with him, miles from anyone who could help. The fire in the hearth suddenly didn't feel so warm. The revelation changed everything. The silence in the cabin was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with unspoken questions. Every time Tala looked at her, she wondered what he was hiding behind those dark, unreadable eyes. Every time he picked up his axe, a sliver of fear ran down her spine. Was his grief real, or was it a performance? Was the story of his wife and child a tragedy, or a lie? She started watching him, not with curiosity, but with the sharp-eyed caution of a trapped animal. She noticed things she hadn't before, He had a small leather pouch he kept by his bed. He never opened it when she was in the room, but sometimes, late at night, she would see him holding it, his knuckles white. What was inside? And there was the scar on his neck. He'd never explained it. The townsfolk whispered it was from a fight with a bear. But now, she wasn't so sure. It looked too clean, too straight. It looked like it had been made by a knife. Despite the fear, she stayed. Where else could she go? Back to the town that scorned her? Back to freezing in a stable? No. Here, at least, she had a fire and food. She would survive, and she would find out the truth. Life continued in its strange, silent rhythm. He provided. She maintained. But now, there was a new tension, a new dance. She started leaving his things alone, afraid of what she might find. She stopped humming the old lullabies from her childhood, afraid of reminding him of the child he claimed to have lost. One afternoon, while mending one of his old buckskin coats, her fingers found it. A dark, stubborn stain hidden in the seam of the sleeve. It was blood. Old, but unmistakably blood. She tried to wash it out, scrubbing with cold water and soap, but the stain was deep, set into the fibers of the leather. That night, as they sat by the fire, she couldn't help herself. "There was a stain on your coat," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I couldn't get it out." He stiffened. He stared into the flames for a long time before he spoke. "Raiders," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Came through years ago, took horses, shot my brother's boy." He paused, and his next words were chilling. "I wore that coat for 3 days, tracking them." "Did you find them?" she whispered. "I didn't find the horses," he said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. The implication hung in the air, thick and terrifying. He hadn't recovered the property. He had delivered justice, or vengeance. She felt a cold dread mix with a strange, dark respect. This man was not just a survivor. He was a predator. The snow began to melt. The world outside started to thaw, but the ice inside the cabin remained. One morning, she woke up to find a small carving on the foot of her bed. It was the bird he had been working on, now finished. Its wings were tucked in, its head bowed. A mourning bird. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking thing, but was it a gift? Or a warning? She didn't thank him. She just picked it up and tucked it into her pocket, the smooth wood a heavy weight against her leg. Later that day, he saw her looking at the beaded curtain again. "You want to know?" he stated. It wasn't a question. She just nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his stone facade, a flicker of profound pain. Her name was Nita, he said. She wasn't from a tribe. She was a settler's daughter, like you. This was new. The town thought his wife had been Comanche. Her family disowned her for marrying me, he continued, his voice low and ragged. We came up here to be left alone. We were happy. He looked at the curtain. When she was with child, she got a fever. The midwife from town wouldn't come, said it was God's punishment. Juniper felt a wave of sickness. She knew that kind of piety. She'd seen it in Mrs. Haskell's eyes. I tried to save her, he choked out, his voice breaking. I did everything the old ways taught me, but the fever took her. And it took the boy. He finally looked at her, his eyes swimming with a grief so raw it was like an open wound. I buried them myself, right out there, under the pines. It was the truth. She could feel it. The pain was too real to be a lie. The story wasn't a cover-up. It was a confession of his failure. He wasn't a murderer. He was a man haunted by his own powerlessness. The fear inside her dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. But his next words sent a new chill down her spine. Her father, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, is a powerful man. He runs that town. He blames me for her death. He thinks I stole her and let her die in the wilderness. Juniper's blood ran cold. Who? She breathed. Who is her father? Tala's eyes burned into hers. "The man you were supposed to marry," he said. "His father, Mr. Haskell." The world tilted on its axis. The entire story rewrote itself in her mind in a blinding flash. She hadn't been left at the altar because she was poor. She had been chosen and then discarded as part of a cruel game of revenge. Mr. Haskell had wanted to hurt the man who stole his daughter, Nita, but Tala was untouchable on his mountain. So Haskell had targeted the next best thing, the memory of his wife. He had found Juniper, another poor, unconnected girl, and offered her up to his son. He had paraded her through the town, a replacement for the woman he'd lost. And then, at the last possible moment, he had snatched it all away, leaving her humiliated and abandoned in the snow, a public execution of her dignity meant to be a message. It was a twisted, symbolic punishment meant for Tala. "You took my daughter, so I'll destroy another in her place." And Mrs. Haskell. Her cruelty wasn't just snobbery, it was the venom of a grieving mother, twisted into a weapon. "They didn't just leave you at the altar," Tala said, his voice thick with a rage that had simmered for years. "They were trying to break you, to show me that anything I might value could be destroyed." Juniper staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. The kindness of the Haskells, the wedding plans, the dress, it had all been a lie, a carefully constructed trap. She wasn't just a jilted bride, she was a pawn in a war she never knew existed. And now she was living under the roof of the man at the very center of it all. The town's whispers weren't just gossip, the sheriff's visits weren't just concern, they were threats. They were watching him, and now they were watching her too. She looked at the wooden bird in her hand. It wasn't a mourning bird, it was a cage, and she had willingly walked right into it. The knowledge was a poison, seeping into every corner of the small cabin. Juniper now understood that the space between her and Tala wasn't just filled with grief. It was filled with the shadow of the Haskell family. Every meal she cooked, every stitch she sewed, felt like an act of defiance against them. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, and she was on the wrong side of a very dangerous feud. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked him that night, her voice shaking with fury. "Why did you let me walk into this?" "Because you weren't looking for a fight," Tala said, his voice calm, but his eyes were like burning coals. "You were looking for a roof. Telling you the truth would have sent you running back down that mountain, and they would have finished what they started." He was right. She would have run, and she would have frozen. He had saved her life, but he had also imprisoned her in his own war. "So what now?" she demanded. "We just hide up here forever while they watch us?" "They won't just watch," Tala said grimly. "The snow is melting. They'll come. Haskell is not a man who leaves a debt unpaid." A strange thing happened to Juniper in the days that followed. The fear and anger began to meld together, forging something new inside her. Resilience. She had been stripped of everything. Her home, her name, her future. All she had left was her own 2 hands and a spirit that refused to be broken. She began to prepare. She learned from him, watching how he set snares, how he read the weather in the clouds, how he could move through the forest without making a sound. She wasn't just mending clothes anymore. She was learning to survive. She insisted he teach her to shoot the rifle. Her first few shots were wild, the kickback bruising her shoulder. But she didn't complain. She just reloaded and fired again, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the target. He watched her, a new expression on his face. It wasn't pity, it was respect. The quiet intimacy of the cabin shifted. They were no longer just 2 lonely souls sharing a space. They were allies. They still didn't touch, but the space between them crackled with a new energy, a shared purpose. They were the outcasts, the survivors, the ones the world had tried to throw away, and they were going to fight back. One evening, as she was cleaning the rifle, he came and stood beside her. He reached out and gently adjusted her grip, his large, calloused hand covering hers for a brief moment. The touch was electric. It wasn't romantic. It was practical. But it was the first time they had made real contact, and it sent a shockwave through the room. "You hold it like this," he said, his voice low. "Brace it against the shoulder. Become part of the wood and the steel. Don't fight it. Guide it." She nodded, unable to speak. His proximity was overwhelming, the scent of pine and leather filling her senses. She could feel the strength in his hand, the quiet power that radiated from him. In that moment, she understood that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was a shield. The thaw came quickly. The mountain began to weep, streams of melted snow carving paths down the slopes, and just as Tala had predicted, they came. It wasn't Mr. Haskell. Not yet. It was Sheriff Keller, and this time he wasn't alone. He had 2 deputies with him, their faces grim, their hands resting on their holstered pistols. "Tala," the sheriff said, his voice strained. "There's been a complaint from Mr. Haskell. He says you're holding this woman against her will. He's formally accused you of kidnapping." Juniper stepped forward, the rifle now held loosely but confidently in her hands. "I am not being held," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I am here because I choose to be." The sheriff looked at her, then at Tala, his eyes lingering on the rifle she was holding. "Miss Wade, you need to understand the position you're in. The Haskells own this valley. The judge, the bank, everything. You are making a very powerful enemy." "I am aware of who my enemies are, Sheriff," she replied coolly. One of the deputies, a young, arrogant man, smirked. "Looks like she's gone native, Sheriff. Got that Stockholm sickness." Tala took a single, silent step forward. The deputy's smirk vanished. "The law says I have to take her statement down in town," Keller said, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. "Haskell is demanding it." "No," Juniper said. "If you want my statement, you can take it right here, on this mountain, on this land which doesn't belong to him." The sheriff sighed, defeated. He knew he couldn't force them without a bloodbath. He took out a notepad. "Fine. State your name for the record." "My name," she said, locking eyes with him, "is Juniper, just Juniper." She was shedding the last piece of her old life, the surname that connected her to a past of poverty and shame. The sheriff wrote it down. "And you are here of your own free will. I have never been more free in my entire life," she said. Keller and his men left, but the air was thick with the promise of more trouble. That night, the unspoken tension in the cabin finally broke. Juniper was sitting by the fire, the wooden bird in her lap, when Tala came to sit beside her. Not across from her, but next to her, their shoulders almost touching. "You have a fire in you," he said quietly. "Haskell tried to put it out, but he only made it burn hotter." "He took everything from me," she whispered. "He tried to make me into nothing. He failed," Tala said. He reached into the small leather pouch he always kept with him, the one she had been so afraid of. He pulled something out and placed it in her hand. It was a woman's ring, a simple, thin band of silver worn smooth with time. "It was Nita's," he said. "It's all I have left of her." Juniper stared at it. It was a peace offering, a sign of ultimate trust. He was sharing his most sacred memory with her. "She would have liked you," he murmured. "She had that same fire." Tears welled in Juniper's eyes. Not of sadness, but of a profound, aching connection. They were bound together by the same enemy, by the same grief. She looked from the ring to his face and saw not a savage, not a predator, but a man who had loved and lost, just like her. She didn't say anything. She just leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't pull away. He sat perfectly still, a warm, solid presence in the darkness. Outside, the world was preparing for war. But inside the small cabin, for the first time, there was peace. And in that moment, Juniper knew she would not just survive, she would win. She would take back her life, and she would help him find justice for the woman he had lost. The Haskells had started a fire, and now, the two of them were going to let it burn. The fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a letter A boy from town, paid a nickel to make the treacherous journey up the mountain, delivered it. It wasn't addressed to Tala. It was addressed to the girl on the mountain. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and sharp. It was from Mrs. Haskell. Juniper's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was short, cruel, and to the point. It didn't threaten violence. It threatened something far worse. You have made your choice to live in squalor with that murderer. So be it. But know this, the land he lives on is not his. My husband holds the deed, a fact he conveniently forgot to mention. We will be arriving in 1 week's time with the federal marshals to evict the squatter from our property. You are welcome to leave with your dignity intact. If you choose to stay, you will be removed as a trespasser. Juniper read the letter twice, the words blurring. A murderer? A deed? She looked at Tala, who had been watching her, his face a grim mask. She handed him the letter. He read it, and a muscle in his jaw clenched. The lie was brilliant in its cruelty. Of course Haskell owned the land. He owned everything. He had allowed Tala to live here in his grief, a king in a cage, knowing he could crush him at any moment. Is it true? She whispered. Did you kill someone? Tala's eyes met hers, and the pain in them was ancient. Nita's brother, he said, his voice a low growl. He came for me after she died, blamed me. He was drunk, mad with grief. He pulled a knife. He instinctively touched the scar on his neck. It was his life, or mine. The sheriff had covered it up, declared it self-defense, but Haskell had never accepted it. He had twisted the story, painting Tala as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered his son after stealing his daughter. It was the story he told the town. It was the story he told his wife. They are coming to destroy this place, Juniper said, her voice hollow, to tear it all down. Everything they had built, the fragile trust, the shared silence, the alliance. It was all built on borrowed land, on borrowed time. Let them come, Tala said, his voice resonating with a sudden, terrifying calm. He walked over to the beaded curtain and tore it down. Behind it, in the room that had been a shrine to his lost wife, he began to pack. But he wasn't packing to leave. He pulled a heavy wooden chest from under the bed. He opened it, and Juniper gasped. It was filled with weapons, not just hunting rifles, Comanche weapons, a bow, arrows tipped with razor-sharp flint, a war club, a tomahawk. It was the arsenal of a man who had not forgotten the old ways. But that wasn't the most shocking thing in the chest. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of papers. Haskell is a liar, Tala said, pulling them out. This land was a gift, from his wife. Juniper stared, confused. What? Before Nita's mother died, years ago, she came to me, Tala explained. She knew her husband was a hard man, a cruel man. She knew he disapproved of Nita and me. She signed the deed to this section of the mountain over to me, a wedding gift, to ensure we would always have a place to be safe from him. It was a secret she had taken to her grave, a final act of rebellion against her domineering husband. Haskell had no idea. He thought he held all the cards, but the true deed, the legal document, was right here in this chest. He thinks he's coming to evict a squatter, Juniper breathed, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. He's the one who's the trespasser. The game had changed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. It was about exposing a powerful man's lies and clearing the names of the dead. The next 6 days were a blur of intense preparation. They didn't fortify the cabin for a fight with guns. They fortified it with the truth. Tala took the deed and hid it in a secure location. Then, they began to prepare for their visitors in a different way. Juniper took Nita's simple silver ring, the one Tala had given her, and threaded it onto a leather cord. She wore it around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt. It was a silent promise. Tala, meanwhile, did something she never expected. He rode down the mountain, not to the town, but to the small, scattered encampments of his people, men and women who had been pushed to the margins by settlers like Haskell. He didn't ask for warriors. He just told them the story. He told them that a great liar was coming to desecrate the land where a good woman was buried. On the morning of the 7th day, Juniper stood on the porch, her heart pounding a steady rhythm against her ribs. She wore a simple doeskin dress, one she had found in Nita's chest, and altered to fit. She looked like she belonged to the mountain. Tala stood beside her, unarmed, his hands loose at his sides. He was calm, rooted. Soon they heard the horses. A small army was coming up the trail. At the front was Mr. Haskell, his face a mask of smug triumph, riding a fine black stallion. Beside him was his wife, her face pinched and cruel. Behind them were the federal marshals and Sheriff Keller, who looked deeply uncomfortable. A small crowd of townsfolk, including Pearl and Nettie, trailed behind, eager to watch the show. They rode into the clearing and stopped, their horses kicking at the dirt. "Tala!" Haskell boomed, his voice dripping with false authority. "Your time on my land is over. You and this woman will vacate the premises immediately." Tala didn't speak. He simply looked at Juniper. It was her turn. Juniper stepped forward. "Mr. Haskell," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the clearing, "I believe you are mistaken. It is you who are trespassing." Haskell laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The girl has lost her mind. Marshals, do your duty. Remove them." "Wait," Juniper said. She looked past Haskell at his wife. "Mrs. Haskell, your husband has told you many stories. He told you this man murdered your son. He told you he owned this land. But there's one story he never told you. The story of why your daughter Nita truly ran away." Mrs. Haskell flinched. "She didn't run away because she was in love with a savage," Juniper continued, her voice rising with power. "She ran away because she was terrified of her own father, a man who promised her to a business partner twice her age, a man who would have sold her like cattle to seal a deal." A murmur went through the crowd. Haskell's face turned purple with rage. "Lies, all lies." "Is it a lie?" Juniper asked, turning to the sheriff. "Sheriff Keller, you were there the night Nita's brother died. You ruled it self-defense. Why did you allow Mr. Haskell to spread the rumor that it was murder?" The sheriff paled, sweat beading on his forehead. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. "And is this a lie?" Juniper pulled out the leather cord from under her dress. Nita's silver ring glinted in the sun. "Mrs. Haskell, you gave this ring to your daughter on her 16th birthday. She gave it to the man she loved, the man your husband drove away." Mrs. Haskell let out a small, strangled gasp. Her carefully constructed world was cracking. "But the biggest lie of all," Juniper announced, her voice ringing like a bell, "is about this land." And that's when they appeared, silently, from the trees, from behind the rocks, they emerged. Dozens of Comanche men and women. They were not painted for war. They carried no weapons. They simply came and stood, forming a silent circle around the clearing. A circle of witnesses. Tala stepped forward. "This land was given to me," he said, his voice deep and powerful, "by a woman who knew her husband's heart was black. She gave me the deed, signed and sealed. It is hidden where your greedy hands will never find it. This is my home. This is where my wife is buried, and you will not set foot on it." Haskell was speechless, his face a mottled mess of fury and shock. He looked at the marshals, but they were staring uneasily at the silent circle of natives surrounding them. They were lawmen, not soldiers. They weren't prepared for this. But the final blow didn't come from Tala or Juniper. It came from behind Haskell. "He's right, isn't he, father?" It was Pearl, her face white, her eyes filled with a dawning horror. She had heard the whispers, seen the proof. She was finally seeing her father for the tyrant he was. Mrs. Haskell finally broke. A loud, ragged sob tore from her throat. She stared at her husband, not with love, but with utter revulsion. "You lied," she whispered. "All this time. You lied." The crowd began to murmur, to back away. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Haskell was no longer the respected town patriarch. He was a liar, exposed in front of everyone he had ruled through fear. He stared at Juniper, his eyes filled with a murderous hatred. He had tried to crush her, to make her an example. Instead, she had become his undoing. She hadn't fought him with weapons. She had fought him with the truth. And she had won. The retreat was a pathetic affair. Haskell, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage, wrenched his horse around without a word. His wife followed, weeping openly. Pearl and Nettie cast one last, long look at Juniper, a look of disbelief and perhaps a sliver of admiration, before turning away. The marshals, looking relieved to avoid a confrontation, tipped their hats and escorted the disgraced family back down the mountain. The crowd of townsfolk melted away, whispering amongst themselves, the story already changing, solidifying into a new legend. Sheriff Keller was the last to leave. He paused, looking at Tala and Juniper, who stood together on the porch of the small, defiant cabin. He didn't say anything. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a sign of surrender, a sign of respect. Then he turned his horse and rode away, leaving them in the quiet clearing. The silent circle of Comanche witnesses began to disperse, melting back into the trees as quietly as they had arrived. They had borne witness. They had supported their own. Justice, in its own way, had been served. Juniper and Tala stood there for a long time, the silence of the mountains settling around them. The air felt different, lighter, cleansed. She looked at the cabin, no longer a prison or a shelter, but a home. Their home, forged in snow and fire and truth. He turned to her, his dark eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "It's over," he said. "No," she replied, a real smile finally reaching her eyes. "It's just beginning." In the weeks that followed, a new life took root on the mountain. Word of Haskell's disgrace spread through the valley like wildfire. His power, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled to dust. People who had once feared him now whispered about him with contempt. The town began to breathe again, and they began to look up at the mountain not with suspicion, but with a kind of awe. The story of the jilted bride and the Comanche widower became a local legend. They were the ones who had stood up to the tyrant, the ones who had chosen truth over comfort. Slowly, people started to make the journey up the trail again. Not with threats, but with offerings. Old Tobias, the town fiddler, came one day and played them a song, his wrinkled face beaming. Hawk, Tala's old friend, brought them smoked salmon and sat with them by the fire, sharing stories in his native tongue. Even Pearl Crane came, alone and on foot. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her face humbled, and offered Juniper a basket of fresh bread. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We were wrong." Juniper accepted the offering. There was no victory in holding a grudge. There was only freedom in letting it go. Life in the cabin found a new rhythm. The silence was still there, but it was a comfortable, easy silence now, filled with unspoken understanding. They worked side by side, their movements a familiar dance. He would bring her a wildflower from the forest. She would mend a tear in his shirt before he even asked. They never spoke of love. The word felt too small for what they had. What they had was deeper, forged in a crucible of loss and survival. It was a bond of mutual respect, of shared strength, of two broken souls who had found a way to become whole again, together. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Tala came to her with a simple question. "Will you walk with me?" He led her not to the grave of his first wife, but to a small, sun-dappled clearing overlooking the entire valley. In the center, he had built a simple arch of woven cedar branches decorated with pine cones and eagle feathers. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have a preacher. He didn't have vows written on paper. He simply took out his knife. He walked to the doorpost of their cabin where he had carved his own name long ago. He added her name beside his. Tala, Juniper. Then he handed the knife to her. She took it, the weight of the steel familiar in her hand. She thought for a moment. Then carefully, beneath their names, she carved a single word. Home. They stood there under the cedar arch as the last light faded, the lights of the town twinkling below like fallen stars. They weren't owned by the town. They weren't defined by their pasts. They were simply two people on their mountain under their sky. He reached out and gently took her hand. His touch was no longer electric with tension, but warm with a quiet certainty. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. It was more intimate than any vow, more powerful than any ceremony. It was a promise made not in words, but in a shared heartbeat. So if you're out there, listening, and you feel like the world has turned its back on you, remember the story of Juniper Wade. Remember that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in fighting, but in enduring, and that the most beautiful homes are not the ones you are given, but the ones you build yourself out of the ashes of who you used to be. True love isn't always a roaring flame. Sometimes it's a quiet fire that someone lights for you in the dark, a fire that promises to never, ever go out. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe that everyone deserves a second chance to find their home, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other stories are waiting to be told.